Добрый день.
Good afternoon.
Мы находимся в зале номер
We
3
are in Hall 3
Государственного
of the
музея
Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts, in the hall where the showcases with exhibits from Heinrich Schliemann's excavations, the Trojan collection, are located.
коллекция Трои.
In this hall, a special section, a special unit, has been set aside where a research project called The Gold of Troy is being carried out.
имеющего название «Золото
What is the essence of the project?
этого проекта.
This project, which we have been striving for many years, is only now being implemented because the museum has gained access to two pieces of very important and state-of-the-art equipment.
Высокого разрешения.
Firstly, a high-resolution microscope which can magnify objects up to 5,000 times. And the second device, which is not yet in the hall, but the museum already has it, is a spectrometer, which allows us to determine with the highest precision the composition of metal of which ancient objects are made.
Итак, мы находимся
So, we are in the first phase of our research project, which involves fixing ancient objects from the Schliemann collection. We have selected a total of 65 objects from the various treasures we have in our museum. The task is to create a complete picture of the shape and features of these objects with appropriate magnification, times 20, times 30, sometimes times 50, taking the finest measurements, micrometric measurements.
создать полную картину о форме и
What is the essence of this first phase? The fact is that previously, when we were preparing a catalogue for the exhibition entitled Treasures of Troy from Schliemann's Excavations, which was held in 1996, we only had a caliper, a ruler, and magnifying glass in our hands. Our possibilities were limited by this arsenal. Therefore, the measurements that were catalogued at the time are precise enough, but not sufficient for modern science.
помещены в каталог, они достаточно точные, но для современной науки недостаточно.
Today, we get measurements of the highest accuracy, which are recorded in an electronic circuit, in an electronic system turned into files. These files contain both an image of the object with the appropriate magnification and the dimensions of all its elements, which we need for research. This is the first phase. The second will examine the composition of the metal from which the ancient objects are made. The metal is sampled without damaging the surface, and samples are taken in different areas, which is what we need this image for. We can mark the points from which we want to take the samples, analyze it, compare it with the relevant databases, and understand, above all, the main thing: from what sources the Trojan jewelers, Trojan metal artists obtained the metal, where there were deposits, where the extraction of precious metal, gold in particular, was conducted. This is the task for today. As I have already said, we have begun its implementation.
История троянской коллекции
The history of the Trojan collection is rather convoluted, dramatic, and not fully known until now, although in many cases it has already been clarified. The fact is that Heinrich Schliemann, an amateur archaeologist and merchant, began excavating Troy in 1871. He sought permission from the Turkish government for a year, and it was not until 1871 that he received this permission. Half of his Salic Hill was owned by Frank Calvert, the British consul in the Dardanelles. By the time Schliemann began his excavations, such was his status. Frank Calvert was a very interesting man who played a significant role in the study of Troy. He was by nature a very humble man who did not stick out, trying to remain in the shadows, but his credit for this is very great. He had, in fact, discovered the location of Troy, and he showed Schliemann where to excavate. Schliemann began by digging two crosswise trenches across the Trojan hill, his Salic Hill. Calvert warned him that the hill is a multi-layered archaeological site, and excavations would have to be carried out very carefully with prior shoring of the surface of the hill. Schliemann replied, as we know from the diaries, I have a lot of money, but not much time. Therefore, I have no time to do pitting. I know Troy is so ancient that it is at the base of the hill, so I order you to dig to the base of the hill. Calvert disagreed with this statement, and we know that they were at odds for a long time. Nevertheless, he helped Schliemann and stayed with him. The question arises, how did Calvert, who was not an archaeologist, know the concepts of cultural layer, pitting, and other things?
Не археолог, знал понятие культурный слой, шурфовка и так далее. Оказывается, в молодые годы
It turns out that in his younger years, he was part of a Russian expedition that conducted research in the Troja area. This expedition was led by an encyclopedically educated Russian scientist, Pyotr Chikachev. His task was to study the flora and fauna of the Turkish coastal region, to study its history, archaeology, geology, geography, and to make topographic plans. The expedition did all this, and it was as part of the Russian expedition that the young Calvert learned the basics of scientific work, such as keeping diaries and exploring by potholing.
Schliemann, в свою очередь, также
Schliemann's fate is also closely linked with Russia, the Russian Empire. Having opened a branch of Schroeder's firm in Russia, which he headed, he independently studied Russian, which was very difficult for a German. In addition, he gradually mastered many more foreign languages as he had an aptitude in this field. And in general, he was an easy learner, quick to grasp, very energetic, enterprising, and courageous. All these qualities certainly were necessary for carrying out archaeological works. But unfortunately, Schliemann lacked training. As a matter of fact, we must confess honestly that in those years, true field archaeology did not yet exist. If Schliemann had listened to Calvert's advice, then of course the work would have gone much more slowly. But many of the mistakes Schliemann had made could also have been either avoided or minimized. But what was done was done. Interestingly, Schliemann in 1873, the third year of his first campaign in May, wrote in his diary, "I have made a great, irreparable, unforgivable mistake. I have destroyed what I sought. I have destroyed that Troy which I wanted to find." Why did he write that? Because he realized that the monument is layered. It contains a series of successive settlements and fortifications. By tearing down the layers, having reached the layer that today is conventionally called Troy II, he unwittingly destroyed all the layers lying above. A large number of building remains from later periods. So, we come to the main question. What did Schliemann discover? What did he destroy? And what objects are located in Hall 3 in the showcases of our museum? In Hall 3 of the Pushkin Museum, from the Troy II layer. That is the third layer from the bottom of the hill where the ancient settlement was located. Today, scholars count layers 0 to 10 and even 11 in Troy in succession. The Troy Schliemann was looking for, described in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, is located, according to contemporary researchers, at the level of layers Troy 6 and Troy 7. It was these layers that Schliemann dug, not realizing at the time what he was doing, realizing it only in the third year of his first campaign.
Именно эти слои и прокопал Schliemann, не понимая тогда, что он делает, осознав это только в третий год своей первой кампании.
It must be said that he acknowledged this mistake. It is certainly to his credit. He returned to the Trojan Hill again after a certain number of years because he had been forbidden by the Turkish government to excavate there because he had taken his collection illegally as contraband to Athens. A trial was subsequently held there, and Schliemann was ordered to pay a very substantial fine. Schliemann paid a considerably larger sum and, in accordance with the law, became the beneficiary of the collection. There could therefore be no further claims against him. Our hall contains objects from 13 treasures found by Schliemann specifically in the Troy II layer. It must be said that in other layers, both under Schliemann and after him, because a large number of researchers worked there, and subsequently a large number of ceramics, bronze objects, stone objects were found, but treasures as such, groups of objects, compactly grouped, were not found anymore.
Но кладов, как таковых, вот этих групп предметов, компактно сгруппированных, найдено больше не было.
It was the layer of Troy II, a layer of fire up to 2 or 4 meters thick, that contained these groups of objects, which were called treasures. So how do we know about these treasures? Curiously enough, Schliemann himself, in fact, never recorded the location of any treasure anywhere. All of his descriptions are rather vague. Schliemann died in 1890, the same year he visited Troy and excavated for the last time. He wrote in his will that documents relating to his archaeological work, particularly the Trojan excavations, could not be published until 100 years after his death. That is, his will expired in 1990. It was not until 1990 that Schliemann's archaeological diaries and other documents were uncovered, and the British researcher, Schliemann's biographer and researcher of his life and work, Donald Easton, was the first to gain access to them. He was a highly educated, decent man who was entrusted by the European scientific community to be the first to touch Schliemann's documents. He made a long, very scrupulous analysis, comparison of all the texts, topographies, and so on. And it is to him that we owe the location of all 19 treasures that Schliemann found, with varying degrees of accuracy, of course. This includes the first treasure, the so-called treasure of Priyam, which was found by Schliemann in 1873, the last year of his first campaign. Schliemann called this treasure the treasure of Priyam because he thought it represented Troy, praised by Homer. He trumpeted, telephoned, and telegraphed his find all over the world. The message had a bombshell effect. All the newspapers and magazines wrote about it. Schliemann became a famous figure. As the newspapers wrote at the time, he became an idol of housewives and first-year students, and at the same time, he earned the contempt and indignation of the scientific community, especially the German one. The scientific community regarded him as self-taught, an upstart, a braggart, a proud man, etc. However, it should be noted that Schliemann, as an enterprising and very well-trained man, was the first archaeologist to use the photographic method in his excavations.
Между тем, следует отметить, что Schliemann, будучи очень предприимчивым человеком и очень хорошо обучаемым человеком, по сути дела является первым археологом, который использовал при своих раскопках фотофиксацию.
The photographic method had been discovered very shortly before his excavations, and he was the first to use it, among other things, to fix mass material, especially fragments of pottery, which he was also the first to notice.
То есть обломки керамики прежде всего. Через год после
A year after the first campaign, he managed to publish a monographic study beautifully published on his own dime, which also became a sensation. In it, he cited not only objects from the Priyam hoard, but also the ceramic material that had accompanied his excavations in the Troy II layer.
Керамический материал, который сопутствовал его раскопкам в слое Троя-2.
So how did this treasure end up in the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts? As I have said, a total of 19 treasures have been recorded, some say 20, but it is believed that 19 treasures are those which Schliemann found during all his excavations in the area of Troy. Our collection contains items from only 13 treasures. At the same time, 414 items are in the collection of the State's Hermitage. After the war in 1945, by decision of the Soviet Control Commission, by the way, the only legitimate authority on the territory of Nazi Germany which signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender, works of art kept in state museums were transferred to the territory of the Soviet Union as partial compensation for the destruction and atrocities which the Nazis committed in the occupied Soviet Union. This is how the treasures made their way into the Soviet Union.
Были перемещены на территорию Советского Союза в качестве частичной компенсации за те разрушения, злодеяния, которые совершили нацисты на оккупированной территории Советского Союза. Так эти клады попали в Советский Союз. Все предметы из драгоценных металлов были
All objects made of precious metals were put in the storage of the Pushkin Museum, while other objects, mainly made of bronze and stone, ended up in the State's Hermitage Museum.
Кладов, поступивших на территорию Советского Союза в 1945 году. Кроме того, часть предметов из клада А, то есть клада Прияма,
This is the fate of the treasures that entered the Soviet Union in 1945. In addition, some items from Treasure A, i.e. the treasure of Priyam, were confiscated at the end of the excavations by the Turkish police from the excavation workers who had stolen the items during their excavations. They wanted to divide this ancient gold among themselves, but, as always happens, quarreled over a share, and one of them denounced it to the police. The items were confiscated, the workers were arrested, and the items then went to the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, where they remain to this day. I had a chance to see them with my own eyes. They were on display at the time. There was a showcase of about 50, maybe 60 items, most of which have equivalents in the collection in our hall. Some of the pieces are still on display in museums in Berlin, particularly the Museum of Ancient and Early History, now on display in the new museum. Another part of the Schliemann collection is held at the University Museum in Rostock. A significant part is also represented in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens.
Итак, вернемся еще раз к принципиальному вопросу, который очень заботит большинство посетителей этого зала, которые впервые пришли в наш музей.
So, let's return once again to the fundamental question, which is of great concern to the majority of visitors to this room who are coming to our museum for the first time. From which layer and at what time are the objects from the treasures displayed in our showcases? I repeat, it is from Troy II. According to current scientific knowledge, the date of this layer is between 2400 and 2200 BC. Correspondingly, Troy 6 and 7, this monument was located much higher in level in the same hill, and it is almost 1,200 years younger.
Это совершенно другая эпоха, другой исторический период.
It is a completely different era, a different historical period, and a completely different population. There appears to have been no continuity between the population of Troy II and Troy VII. Troy II existed at a time when there was no written language in the region, so no written sources have survived. This period is referred to in science as the Early Bronze Age.
Troy 7, Troy 6 это тоже бронзовый век.
Troy 6 to 7 is also Bronze Age, but the Late Bronze Age, a period much closer to us. And it is precisely the echoes of those events, which were connected with the siege and subsequent destruction of Troy 7, that are preserved by the legend which in oral form reached Homer.
Schliemann, который говорил, что он верит Гомеру
who
как
said that he
Библии,
believed Homer to be the Bible, was looking specifically for Troy 7. He didn't know then that it was called Troy 7, a modern scientific notion. He was looking for Homer's Troy, and he found, by destroying part of Homer's Troy, an earlier civilization, older by 1,200 years.
Естественно, что для европейской науки это было сенсацией.
Naturally, this was a sensation for European science. This hotbed of culture had never been known before, by the way, and today it has not been continued despite the huge amount of archaeological material obtained in Anatolia in Turkey and in the surrounding area and in the Aegean basin, we still do not have close equivalents to the Trojan things.
По-видимому, катастрофа, которая случилась в Трое-2,
Apparently, the catastrophe that happened to Troy II also put an end to the large population of this cultural center located in a very favorable economic and strategic area.
И этот локальный очаг цивилизации
The development of this local center of civilization was artificially interrupted by the catastrophe and had no continuation. Such is the fate of the bearers, as scholars say, of the culture that gave us the treasures we see in the hall of our museum.
давшие нам те сокровища, которые мы видим в зале нашего музея. Schliemann же,
Schliemann, who tried to find Troy 7 and realized that he had destroyed it, continued excavating and, indeed, dug the layers of both Troy 6 and Troy 7, found objects related to this period, and found a layer of fire, which refers to this time. His work was continued by his pupil and assistant Dörpfeld, a German archaeologist. Later, the American explorer Blegan dug on the Trojan Hill, followed by a number of scholars, and finally, in the 1990s and early 2000s, Manfred Kaufmann, a professor at the University of Tübingen, and then Professor Ernst Pernicka of the same university, dug there.
Все эти ученые внесли огромный вклад в изучение холма
All of these
Гисарлык,
scholars have made immense contributions to the study of the Hisarlik Hill, this unique archaeological site, and have contributed significantly to museum collections, and have also solved the question of where Troy was located.
Он примерно 380 метров в длину и 280 метров в поперечнике.
Since the hill itself has relatively modest dimensions, about 380 meters in length and 280 meters in cross-section, most of Homer's critics said, where were the thousands and tens of thousands of soldiers who defended it placed in this small fortress? Where could it all have been? None of this is true. It is all a legend. Manfred Kaufmann, as I said, the German researcher, professor at the University of Tübingen, during the excavations on the hill and in the plain itself, adjacent to the hill, found the remains of a huge settlement, enormous for those days, about 800 to 900 meters in cross-section. It had an oval shape adjoining the hill, and it is clear that this was the ancient city of Troy in 6 and 7. And Hisarlik Hill was its acropolis, with palaces, rooms and buildings inhabited by the nobility and the king of this ancient city. On the territory enclosed by a ditch carved in the rock that framed the perimeter of the 800-meter across settlement, there were the remains of ancient houses inhabited by the population of the ancient city of Troy 7, and naturally, thousands of warriors who defended this city could have been stationed there. Thus, the question of the Trojan War pertaining to Troy 7, Homer's Troy, has been removed. The tradition, the legend preserved to us in Homer's poems are actually real events which genuinely took place in the 12th or early 11th century BC, and which are connected with a very serious problem, the so-called Late Bronze Age catastrophe, which entailed a great resettlement of peoples. These are the sea peoples. And I want to point out that this episode, which according to Homer lasted 10 years, the siege lasted 10 years, and then 10 years the return of the heroes from under the ruined Troy to their places of living, these are events that are connected to one of the small episodes of the Great Migration for the peoples. The sea people reached the coasts of modern-day Turkey, Syria, and Palestine as far as Egypt. They engaged in struggles, battles, naval and land battles with the pharaohs of Egypt and with other rulers they met on their way. They went with their families, with wagons carrying women and children as well. This is a different story. The story related to the migration of the peoples of the sea has nothing to do with the objects on display in this hall. This story is much later, 12th and early 11th century BC. Troy II, the treasures of which are exhibited in our hall, are from 2400 to 2200 BC. This is early Bronze Age. We must honestly
Надо
say
честно сказать,
that
что
these
эти
things
вещи
are
цены не
priceless.
имеют.
They are
Они
priceless
не имеют
first
прежде
and
всего
foremost
потому цены,
because
что
they
это
are utterly
совершенно
unique
уникальные
items,
вещи, относящиеся к
belonging to a
уникальной,
unique,
не имеющей
discontinued
продолжения
branch of human culture
ветви
and
человеческой
civilization.
культуры и цивилизации.
They are
Они
priceless.
бесценны.
Every item
Каждый
is
предмет бесценен.
priceless.